welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. I'd like to welcome you all to this 3-class series in connection with Trisha's Summer Kollel, which is on the theme of universalism and particularism. And tonight we are joined by Rabba Wendy Amsellem for a session called Does God Want Other Nations to Keep the Torah? An Aggadic History. Rabba Wendy Amsellem teaches Talmud and Halacha at Yeshivat Maharat and directs the Beit Midrash program, a joint project of Maharat and Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. She also teaches regularly at Drisha, Pardes, and the Temple Emmanuel Stryker Center. Rabba Wendy received smicha from Yeshivat Maharat and is an alumna of the Drisha Scholars Circle. She has a BA in History and Literature from Harvard University. So I'd like to take a moment to encourage you to ask questions, either by unmuting yourself or putting your questions in the chat. If you're comfortable doing so, we'd love for you to turn on your video camera to actively participate. And now, without further ado, Rabba Wendy Amsellem.
Great, Sarah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be learning with everybody tonight. And again, exactly as Sarah said, if anybody has a comment or a question, please either just unmute yourself or put it in the chat, and hopefully Sarah or I will see it. So I think that when we think about this question of universalism and particularism, one kind of core question at the heart of it is, do we think it would be better if the entire world kept the Torah? Right? Would that be some sort of ideal situation or not? And I think on the one hand, to the extent that we believe the Torah to be a moral code, it seems like, yeah, that would be ideal, right? If everybody kept these laws, that would be a great thing. On the other hand, to the extent that the Torah has a message that's grounded in a particular story of a particular people, right? The story of the people of Israel. What would it mean if everyone kept the Torah? What would that mean for the particular story of the people of Israel? There's a very famous Aggadic idea that we are going to trace this evening, that before God offered the Torah to the people of Israel, God offers the Torah to other nations. And I think that that's a really interesting thing to think about, right? Why would the rabbis want us to imagine the Torah being offered to other people first? What does that mean about about the Jewish people's special role in receiving the Torah, right? Are they the last ones to be invited to the party? If God intends for the Torah to be specifically for the people of Israel all along, why bother offering it to other people? And really, what's God's agenda, right? Is when God offers the Torah to the other nations, is God hoping that the other nations will accept it, or is God not? And what we're going to look at tonight are 4 different kind of refractions of this Aggadic idea of God offering the Torah around. And we'll see that kind of the meaning of that offering will shift depending on which text we're looking at. So the earliest version that we have of this idea appears in source number 1. I will share my screen now. So the earliest version of this idea appears in the Mechilta. Mechilta is a work of Tannaitic Midrash. It's from roughly the same time period as the Mishnah, so kind of early 3rd century or so. Scholars disagree about whether the Mechilta and other works of Midrash Halacha predate the Mishnah or postdate it, but they're basically from roughly the same time period. And this is kind of our first encountering with this idea of God offering the Torah. So we see over here in source number 1, we're told, "Ulefichach nitba'u umot ha'olam." Therefore, the other nations, the nations of the world, were asked, they were offered the Torah, "Kedei shelo litein pitchon pe lahem klapei shechina." The whole reason why God offers them the Torah is so that way afterwards, they're not able to open their mouths to God. In other words, they're not able to complain, saying the following thing, "Ilu nitba'anu kvar kibalnu aleinu." Right? God is worried that at some point in the future, if God doesn't offer the Torah now, the other nations will say, "Hey, what's going on? It's really not fair. If you had offered the Torah to us, we would have also accepted it. So it's not fair to make the nation of Israel be special, right? They had access to something that we didn't have access to." And so therefore God offers them the Torah in order to be able to say, "Haresh nitba'u v'lo kiblu alehem." God wants to be able to say, look, you were offered the Torah, you didn't accept it. And so now the fact that Israel has a particular special status makes sense because Israel was willing to accept this and you weren't. Now, how do we know this, right? Nowhere in the Torah does it say that God offers the Torah around to other nations, right? For people who've read both the telling of the giving of the Torah in the book of Exodus and also in the book of Deuteronomy, at neither point do we hear about God offering the Torah around. But The Midrash here locates the idea of God offering the Torah around from a verse in chapter 33 of the book of Deuteronomy. The verse starts over here, we see it on our source, Vayomar Hashem misinai ba. I'll just read you the whole verse, you'll have it in your minds. Hashem misinai ba v'zarach meseir lamo, hofia mehar paran ba'ata merivavot kodesh, miyimino ishdat lamo. For people who have the practice of going to synagogue on Simchat Torah, this verse might sound very familiar. It's the second verse of Parshat V'zot HaBracha. Many synagogues have the tradition of reading these verses over and over again so that every person who wants to can be called up to the Torah to get an aliyah. So it might sound like a familiar pasuk. But the idea of the verse, right? So God, in the verse, God comes from Sinai. And then the next part of it is Vizarach mi Seir lamo, and shines forth from Seir. Seir is normally associated with the descendants of Esav. And so the assumption of the Midrashist here is that God is at Sinai about to give the Torah to the people of Israel, but first goes to Esav, first goes to the descendants of Esav. You'll notice here he's called Esav Harasha, Esav the wicked one. So God says to the descendants of Esav, Torah, would you like to accept the Torah? And they very reasonably say, Ma ketiva, well, what's written in the Torah? Amar lahem lo tirtzach. So God says to the descendants of Esav, in the Torah it says, thou shalt not kill, or do not murder. Amru, zohi yerusha shehorishenu avinu. They say, wait, killing, that's the inheritance that our father Esav gave us. As we know, actually, the truth is, here it might really refer even to Isaac, right? Isaac gives Esav a bracha, al charbecha tichya, you will live by your sword, right? And so if this is the blessing that our father inherited, right, living by the sword, we can't give up on living by the sword and killing people. The Torah is obviously not for us. You remember the next part of the verse is Hofia Mehar Paran. Midbar Paran is associated with Yishmael. He lives there. And so now in the Midrash, God goes and visits, not Yishmael, God goes and visits Ammon and Moab, Nigla al b'nei Ammon and Moab, and God says to the descendants of Ammon and Moab, Mekablim atem et Torah, will you accept the Torah? Amru lo ma katuva, they also say, well, what's written in the Torah? Amar lahem lo tinaf, God says, in the Torah it says, do not commit incest. They respond and they say, Kulanu miniuf. They say, wait a minute, that's our family story. Our mothers slept with our father, who was also their father, right? That's the story of Lot and his daughters. We all come from this incestuous relationship. And so therefore, it does not make sense. We cannot possibly accept a Torah that forbids incest. Dichtiv, as we know from the verse, but Taharana shnei benot Lot me'aviham. The two daughters of Lot were impregnated by their father. So in that case, how could we possibly accept it? God then moves on to Yishmael. This is the Midbar Paran reference. And God speaks to the descendants of Yishmael and says to them, Mekablim atem et Torah, will you accept the Torah? And they, of course, say also very reasonably, Ma katuba, what's written in the Torah? God says in the Torah, it says, Lo tignov, do not steal. They say, they say, wait a minute, the angel, when he visited our ancestor Hagar, the angel promised Hagar that Yishmael will be this wild man, his hand will be in everything. And so we know that the descendants of Yishmael are sort of connected to stealing, and they say, we can't possibly accept the Torah if the Torah says, do not steal. When God finally gets back to Sinai and gets to the people of Israel. That's the end of that verse from Parshat V'zot HaBracha. At God's right hand was a fiery law unto them, and they immediately, the people of Israel, don't ask Ma katuba, instead, Patchu kulam pihem v'amru, they all opened their mouths and they said, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. Whatever God says, we will do and we will hear, and so there is a total acceptance on their part of the Torah. I'm going to stop the share for one moment. So I think the two sort of main questions we'd want to ask about this Midrash. The first question is, what's the point of this Midrash? The author of this Midrash want us to know. So for people who I guess are in the Zoom, I'm curious if anybody has any ideas. What do you think? What's the goal of the author of this Midrash? Do you have any thoughts? Let's see if anybody is.
It would seem to be about muting the moral objection that Israelites themselves might have.
Okay, say a little more. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an in-house communication, because it's hardly believable, because it's quoting our internal traditions, and we don't, if you want to know whether it was taken around to those other nations, well, ask them what their Zakanim have told them. But that's not what the rabbis say you should do.
Okay, that is a great point, right? So obviously this Midrash is written from within the tradition of the people of Israel. But I think even on its own terms, it's interesting to think about what is the goal of this Midrash, right? What does the Midrash want us to know? And I think right from the start, we know that the Midrash doesn't assume that God offers the Torah around in a neutral way, right? Because from the very beginning, we're told the reason why God offers the Torah is so that afterwards people won't be able to complain about it, right? That's the thinking. It's not that God offers the Torah because maybe they'll say yes. If God offers the Torah, God knows that they're going to say no, but God afterwards doesn't want them to be able to complain. Although, as we'll see in source number 4, it doesn't really help. They wind up complaining anyway. But here it seems as if God is trying to sort of plan from the beginning, so that way later on they won't be able to have an argument. And it seems as if part of that is that when each nation asks what's in the Torah, God specifically chooses to tell them the commandment that would be most difficult for them, right? So for Esau, it's not killing. For Ammon and Moab, it's incest and so forth. But there's a sort of a calculated choice to present them with the mitzvah that would make it most difficult for them to accept the Torah. And for several of them, it seems like what they're saying is this goes against our core identity, right? We were blessed by angels or blessed by our ancestors with the following behavioral attributes. And so the Torah really just doesn't speak to us at all. Okay, the second question that I have about this Midrash is, what do you think would happen if the people of Israel had said, Ma katuv ba, what's in the Torah? Right? Because one way to read the Midrash is that maybe the problem is that if you ask what's in the Torah, right, maybe you're always going to find something that makes the Torah be not feel like it couldn't possibly be for you. And so maybe the reason why the people of Israel are able to accept the Torah is that they're able to accept it without asking questions, right? That's one way to read it. The other way to read it, I think, is that God all along wants the people of Israel to get the Torah. And so God is going to engineer a situation where they will want the Torah. And so it could be that when the nation of Yishmael asks what's in the Torah, God says, don't steal, because God knows that will be the most difficult for them. But it could be that when Israel asks what's in the Torah, maybe God would choose a mitzvah that would be really lovely for them. Like, God might say, well, let me tell you all about Shabbat. Shabbat is a really great mitzvah. You're going to love it, right? So it's possible that God would respond with something that the people of Israel would want in order to make sure that Israel would say yes. Or it's possible that if Israel had asked the question of what's in the Torah, maybe God would respond with something that would be equally difficult for the people of Israel to keep. Like, for example, midvar sheker tirchak, stay away from deceit. And the people of Israel might say, well, wait a minute, our ancestor Jacob got his blessing through deceit. The Torah isn't for us, right? So we don't really know. We don't know what the scenario would be if the people of Israel had asked what's in the Torah. But given that the whole Midrash is kind of crafted around the idea that God is offering the Torah to the other nations because God knows that they will say no, it seems likely that no matter what, God is going to sort of create a situation where the people of Israel will want to say yes. It seemed like there was maybe a question from Lisa. Lisa, do you have a question? Oh no, just receive the link. Okay, yeah, Stephen, please.
It seems to me also that it's quite obvious that what Chazal are doing here is they're making a pitch for a basic attitude of not selfishness in regard to with the attitude that one should have in terms of the Torah. You shouldn't look at the Torah in terms of what benefit it will give you or what deficits it will cause you, but you should be prepared. You should want, just because of wanting the relatedness to God, to take it on no matter what.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I would say, in addition to that, I think it's sort of it seems to me to be clear in this midrash that God intends for the Torah to be specifically for the people of Israel, right? And the fact that the Torah is offered around is almost just kind of a farce, but there's no real assumption that the other nations will say yes to it, and God is kind of engineering a situation where they will not say yes. Now, I want to point that out because we're going to look at the second source right now that has a very different perspective on it. Here we go. Oh, sorry, I think I just shared the wrong thing. Second. Here we go. Okay, here we go. Source number 2. This is from Shemot Rabba. We're taking kind of a big chronological jump. Shemot Rabba is a relatively late midrash. People think it was put together sometime between the 10th and the 12th century. So we're skipping a couple of hundred years, but thematically something very interesting happens over here. And then afterwards, we'll return to our regular chronology. So in this midrash in Shemot Rabba, if you remember, the main thing that we noticed in the first source is that the people of Israel don't ask what's in the Torah. And it seems kind of praiseworthy there, right? It seems as if the fact that they're willing to accept the Torah without asking is partly why they are the right receivers of the Torah. And in this midrash, I would say Israel's not asking is kind of problematized as opposed to praised. So we're going to start with the same idea that God offers the Torah around. We're told, Ela b'sha'a she'akadosh baruch hu ba litena Torah, lo kiblua achat min ha'umot ele Yisrael. When God wanted to give the Torah, God offers the Torah around to other nations, but no other nation will accept it except for Israel. Mashal. So now we're going to tell a parable. We're going to compare this to a story. Lemelech shehaya lo sadeh. It's like a king who has a field. V'haya mevakesh lemosra la'arisim. The king would like to entrust his field to sharecroppers who will work the field and give the king a percentage of the produce. And given that what the king is going to be getting is a percentage of whatever the farmer is able to produce, the king obviously wants a farmer who will be very industrious and kind of produce a lot of crops such that the king's share will be greater. So the king begins to interview potential sharecroppers. Karala Rishon summons in the first one, but Amarlo, tekabel tahasadeh hazo, will you accept this field? Amarlo, ein bikoach kashehemeni. Potential sharecropper number 1 says, no, I don't have the strength to work this field. It is too hard for me. I can't accept it. And so too, the second and third and fourth potential sharecroppers, they all say, no, too much work for me, I can't do it. So then the king, standard for God, the king summons the fifth sharecropper, and the king says, oh, will you accept this field? So the fifth sharecropper says, yeah, sure, I would be happy to accept it. But you'll accept it in order to work it and give me my share of the produce. Fifth sharecropper says, yeah, no problem, happy to do it. But then when the fifth sharecropper takes possession of the field, what does he do? He just leaves it fallow. He doesn't work it at all. The Midrash says, who is the king going to be angry about? Is the king going to be angry at sharecroppers 1, 2, 3, and 4 who said, we can't accept this field, it's too much for us? Or will the king not in fact be angry at the one who said, I can do it, but then doesn't actually work the field at all? Certainly the king will be angry at the fifth sharecropper who accepted the field and then reneged on what he had undertaken to do. So too, now we're moving out of the parable back into our main point. So too, when God appeared on Har Sinai, God did not leave aside a single nation upon whose doors God did not come knocking, asking if they wanted the Torah. But none of the nations would agree to accept the Torah to keep it. The people of Israel said right away, sure, and whatever God says, we will do and we will hear. And so the Midrash says, therefore, people of Israel, you really need to keep the Torah. Now, what I find really interesting about this source is that we have that same basic idea, right? That God offers the Torah around to other nations. The other nations don't accept it. The people of Israel do. But in the first Midrash, it was all about how special the people of Israel are. God all along intends for them to get the Torah. God's only offering it around because God knows the other nations will say no. And in the end, the people of Israel are so wonderful, they don't ask any questions, they just accept it. Here, it's the same basic premise, right? God offers the Torah around, people of Israel don't ask any questions. But here, the Midrash kind of problematizes it and says, well, maybe the people of Israel are a little bit overly blithe, right? Maybe they're like that fifth sharecropper who says yes without really thinking about whether they can really do it. And it seems like, at least in the parable, there's no blame attached to sharecroppers 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? They sort of carefully consider the work involved and they say, look, I can't do it. And because they never sign up for the job, the king is not angry at them for not doing the job. Whereas the fifth sharecropper is really kind of considered to be blameworthy because the fifth sharecropper undertook to do something and didn't. And one of the things I want to highlight over here is that in the parable, the king seems to be pretty neutral between the different sharecroppers, right? There's nothing that indicates the king would prefer for the fifth sharecropper to get it, right? Anyone who would be willing to accept it would be great, right? We don't get the sense from the parable and the Midrash that the king has a preference between the sharecroppers. And if we then sort of apply that to Israel and the other nations, it seems as if God is kind of totally neutral about which people will accept the Torah. It doesn't matter to God. If Moab would accept it, that would also be great, right? It's basically whoever it is that would want the Torah and be willing to do it, God would be willing to give it to them. And then the question is really just, are they actually able to live out their words? They're able to sort of perform what they've undertaken. It seemed like someone had a question. Let me just see. It was someone whose last name was Hurth, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Evelyn. It seems that because Bnei Israel do not ask any questions, it almost negates the contract. You know, they're going into it unknowing, so how can you hold them responsible? So why should God be angry with them?
That's a very interesting question, Evelyn. So you're saying, like, look, maybe it's like those release forms where if you don't actually,
if you don't read the fine print, you know,
responsible because you don't know what's inside of it, right? But I think that might be a pretty modern approach. I think that until recently, I think the sense would be if you don't bother to ask questions, then you're kind of responsible, right? Because you should have, if you cared enough about the implications, if you were, I would say maybe in a different mode, if you were really serious about the undertaking, then you would read the fine print, right? If you really understood what you were getting into, you would read the fine print, you would think about whether you could do it. And there's almost a sense that the fifth sharecropper isn't thinking so clearly, right? He's just saying yes to say yes, but he's not really going to be able to follow through. And
I think you also have that, I don't know whether it's a parable or it's something actually in the Torah, I don't remember, the har kafaf tahar on top of Bnei Israel and you force them. So, you know, naturally, if they're being forced into something, they'll say nasa v'nishma without actually asking any questions. So there again, why blame them?
Yeah, so that's a great point, Evelyn. And in fact, in our fourth source, that idea of God only holding the Torah over the heads of the people of Israel and not the other nations is going to emerge as one of the challenges that the other nations bring to God. You didn't force us, you forced the people of Israel. But I think in this Midrash, right, if you think about the parable, there's no sense over here that the fifth sharecropper is under any sort of duress, right? The fifth sharecropper is kind of being made the same offer as 1, 2, 3, and 4. No duress at all. The king seems to be totally neutral about who would say yes. And the only question really is who is willing to do it. And I would say based on this Midrash, the sense seems to be that, yeah, God would have been very happy for the other nations to receive the Torah. God would want anyone who wants to accept the Torah to receive it, which is a very, I think, kind of universal idea about the Torah, right? The Torah is there for whoever is willing to accept it. And it's very hard to do. So a person might very reasonably be reluctant to accept it, as sharecroppers 1, 2, 3, and 4 were reluctant. But if you are going to accept it, don't accept it on a whim. You have to kind of really be committed to it. That seems to be the point of source number 2. Okay, I'm just going to move on to source number 3 in the interest of time. Source number 3 also kind of takes this idea in a different way. Source number 3 is from Rabba. Rabba, now we're back in the right chronological order. If the Mechilta is sort of early 3rd century, Eicha Rabbah is thought to be probably early 5th century, sort of roughly contemporary with the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay, and Eicha Rabbah, of course, is a work of Midrash on the Book of Lamentations. It's often seen as a work of protest Midrash, right? If Eicha, the Book of Lamentations itself, is about the people of Israel kind of accepting responsibility for their sins and for their punishment, the Book of Eicha Rabbah is kind of a protest against it, right? Basically, often the point of the Midrashim in Eicha Rabbah is, God, did you really need to do this to us? Is this really what we deserve? Couldn't you have done something different? And this Midrash is no different. Here in Eicha Rabbah, we're told, Mashal lemelech sheka'as al matron. It's like a parable of a king who got really angry at the matron. The matron seems to be his queen. He's very angry at her, and so he banishes her from his palace. Now, right from the start, right, the story begins at a point that makes us feel more sympathetic to the matron, because we have no idea why the king is angry, right? If we were told the matron did this, this, and this, and then the king got angry, we might feel differently. But here, the king just gets angry. As far as we know, the matron has done nothing at all to incite the anger, and so, she seems to be in a sad position. The king is really angry at her. The king banishes her from the palace. What does she do? Instead of actually leaving the palace, she goes and she hides behind a pillar. Now, as anybody who's ever played hide and go seek knows, hiding behind a pillar is not a great hiding spot, because the moment somebody walks on the other side of the pillar, they will see you, right? So sure enough, Nimtza HaMelech Over, the king passes by, V'ra'ota, and he sees her, because she's not in a great hiding place. And the king says to her, Akshit apech, your face is hard. You are so brazen. What are you still doing here in my palace? I kicked you out. How is it that you're still here? Amralo, Aduni HaMelech, kach yafeli, v'kach na'eli, v'kach ra'ui. The woman says back to the king, actually, my master, the king, it is entirely proper and fitting and appropriate that I am still here. Why? No other woman would have you except for me, right? I was the only one willing to marry you. And because I was the only one willing to marry you, you owe me now. You can't just kick me out just because you've gotten angry at me. The king says to her, the king says, what are you talking about? I disqualified every other woman in order to choose you, right? You were the one I wanted always. What do you mean no other woman would have me other than you? I said no to everybody else in order to be with you. Amralo, the matron, says back to the king, really? Is that true that you chose me all along? Im kain, lama nichnasta limavui ploni ulachatzer ploni ulamakom ploni. She says, really, if that's so, what were you doing on such and such side street and in such and such court and in this place? Weren't you in all those different places because you were pursuing these different women who in the end would not have you? And so basically the wife says to the king, look, I know where you were. I know that you were going around pursuing all these other women. None of them would have you. I alone was willing to accept you. And given that I alone was willing to accept you, you really owe me something. You can't just turn me out now. So now we move from the mashal to the nimshal, from the parable back to the main story. God says to the people of Israel, presumably God has gotten angry at the people of Israel, just like the king got angry at the matron. God has banished the people of Israel and exiled them from their land, just like the king has banished the matron from the palace. And the people of Israel do not want to leave. So God says to them, Akshitun apehun, your faces are so hard, you are so brazen. What are you still doing here? I kicked you out. And the people of Israel say back to God, Ribono shalom, kach yafel lanu, v'kach na'el lanu, v'kach hagum lanu. They say, no, it is entirely fitting and right and appropriate that we are still here. Because no other nation would accept your Torah except for us. Amar lahem, God says to them, Anihu shepasalti kol ha'omot b'shvilchem. God says, what are you talking about? I disqualified every other nation in order specifically to choose you. What do you mean no other nation would have my Torah except for you? Amrulo, and then the people of Israel say back to God, If it's really true that you had been choosing us all along, what were you doing offering your Torah around to all the other nations? If you really wanted to give the Torah to us, why didn't you ask us first? Why were you offering the Torah to everybody else? Tanya, as we learned in the earlier Braita on the Mechilta, in the beginning, God appeared to the descendants of Esav, as the verse says, Vayomar Hashem Sinai ba v'zarach me'seir, v'lo kiblua, and the descendants of Esav did not receive the Torah. Then God offers the Torah to the descendants of Ishmael. They also don't accept it, as we know from the next part of the verse, Hofia Mehar Paran. In the end, God offers the Torah to Israel, and Israel accepts the Torah. As we know, the end of that verse. And God came forth from the myriads, and God's right hand was a fiery law unto them. And it says that the people of Israel responded, whatever God has said, we will do and we will hear. Okay, so I really like this last version, this third version of the Midrash, because I think what we get over here is the sense that sometimes the same set of actions looks really different depending on whose perspective you have, right? In the Mechilta, in our source number 1, the perspective was God's perspective, right? We know that God is offering the Torah around to the other nations because God doesn't want them to complain later, but God knows all along that they're going to say no, right? And in fact, God engineers situations where they will definitely say no by specifically telling them the verses that are most, the commandments rather, that are most difficult for that particular nation to keep. So in source number 1, we know that all along God wants the Torah to go to the people of Israel. And in source number 3, what we're told is that even though God might know that, it doesn't look that way to the people of Israel. What the people of Israel just see is God offering around the Torah to everybody else, only coming to them last. And they feel kind of bad about it, right? Why are we your last choice? Why did you offer it to everyone else before me, right? And making it into, instead of receiving the Torah, making it into this idea of the king kind of proposing to all these other women who turn him down, other than the matron who in the end accepts him, right? We get the sense that, yeah, you know, if you were the very last romantic partner, right, that was being, the last person who's invited to a party, or the last person who is being asked out, that never feels good to anyone. And the people of Israel say, like, yeah, that really wasn't so great for us. There we were standing at Sinai. You, God, were offering the Torah around to everybody else other than us. That felt bad to us, but we were still willing to accept your Torah. We alone were willing to accept your Torah. Therefore, God, you owe us something special, right? We have become special, not necessarily because we accepted the Torah, but we've become special because we were the only ones willing to accept the Torah, which is an interesting view on the kind of particular status of the people of Israel, right? In source number 1, God all along wants Israel to get the Torah, and God engineers a situation where it's only Israel who will accept it. In source number 2, God seems to be actually entirely neutral about who accepts the Torah. Basically, whoever's willing to, that's great. And in source number 3, we're told, even if from God's perspective, God was planning all along for Israel to get the Torah, from Israel's perspective, Israel says, well, it feels to us like actually we were your last choice, God, but we were still willing to do it. And because we alone were willing to accept the Torah, therefore, we're special because no one else was willing to do what we're doing. We're not special because you chose us. We're special because we chose you, right? We were the only people, even though we came last, we were the only people willing to say yes. Okay, let's now look at source number 4. Source number 4 always makes me feel kind of sympathetic almost for God. Because if you remember, in source number 1, we were told the whole idea of offering the Torah around to the other nations was specifically in order to bring about, to forestall any potential complaints later on. And what we find out over here in source number 4 is that it doesn't really work. The other nations still will have complaints. Source number 4 is from the Babylonian Talmud, from Tractate Avodah Zarah. The Babylonian Talmud, most scholars think, was put together at around 500 or 600 CE, so it's the next one in line after Rabba, certainly before Shemot Rabbah, which source number 2, which was much later. And here, this text over here from the beginning of, sorry, it should not be, Yeah, this is right. This source over here from the beginning of Masechet Avodah Zarah begins with this particular vision of the end of days. We're told, Darash Rabbi Chanina bar Papa v'itema Rabbi Simlai. The following teaching was said either in the name of Rabbi Chanina bar Papa or in the name of Rabbi Simlai. La'atid lavo mevi HaKadosh Baruch Hu sefer Torah u'menicho b'cheko. At the end of days, this is what God will do. God will bring a sefer Torah, place the sefer Torah in God's bosom, and God will say, Lemisha asakba yavo v'yitol scharo. Any person who has busied themselves with the study of Torah, with the keeping of the Torah, let them now come forward and receive their reward. So as soon as they hear that there's reward being given out, all of the other idolatrous nations kind of join together. The image that I have over here, if anybody's ever tried to get onto a crowded bus in Israel, you know, that kind of like everybody kind of comes forward trying to like push to the front. That's the image over here. They all come forward because they all want the reward that is on offer. And how do we know this? We know this from a verse in the book of Isaiah. Kol hagoyim nikbetzu yachdav. All of the nations gather together in order to receive the Torah. Amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, al tikansu lefanai b'erbuvia. God says, no, this is not proper. Don't come to me all kind of mixed together in one group. Let each and every nation come separately with its scribes. We can discuss whether they've kept the Torah, and then we can see if they will get a reward. The Gemara now says, is there really such a thing as like a jumble of people before God? Isn't God able to kind of see each individual separately, no matter how many people are standing there before God? Why would God care if there was a whole, tumultuous mixture of people coming forward? And the response the Gemara gives is, really, the reason why God doesn't want them to be in this whole kind of jumbled crowd in front of God is not because it matters to God, but rather God wants each and every nation separately to hear the message that God has for that nation. Right? So if we were to sort of think about it maybe from a little bit of a question of like universal versus particular, right? The Irbuvia, that jumbled mass of people, was kind of this universal notion of everybody coming forward at the same time. And God seems to be saying, no, I actually have a particular message for each particular group of people, and therefore I need for people to kind of come forward in an orderly manner. So who comes first? Right? The first group of people to come and try to get a reward are the people of the kingdom of Edom. Amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So God begins to interview them to see whether they've kept the Torah and they deserve a reward. God says to them, B'mai asaktem. What have you busied yourself with? What have you occupied yourselves with? Omrim lefanav, the people of Edom respond and they say, Ribono shalom, harbe shvakim takninu. We built many marketplaces. Harbe merchatzaot asinu. We built many bathhouses. Harbe kesef v'zahav hirbinu. Right? We amassed tons of gold and silver. V'kulam lo asinu ela bishvil Yisrael. And actually, when we built the markets and the bathhouses and we gathered all the gold and the silver, we really did it all for the sake of Israel. So that way the people of Israel would be able to learn Torah. In other words, people of Israel, we didn't want them to have to build their own bathhouses, organize their own markets, gather their own riches. We did all of this work just so that Israel could learn Torah, and therefore we deserve to be rewarded for Israel's Torah. Amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God responds and says, Shotim sheba'olam, you foolish people. Kol ma she'asitem litzorech atzmachem asitem. All of the things that you did, you really only did it for yourselves. You didn't do it for the people of Israel. Tikantim shvakim, why did you establish markets? Not to make life easier for the people of Israel so that they could buy produce without having to plant it themselves, but rather, lahoshiv bahem zonot. Why do you have these markets? You just wanted a place for your prostitutes to sit. Merchatzaot, the bathhouses, it wasn't because you cared about the public hygiene of the people of Israel. It was la'adein bahem atzmachem. You just wanted to indulge and pamper yourselves. And the fact that you amassed a lot of gold and silver, kesef v'zahav shalihu. God says the gold and silver actually all belongs to me anyway. As we know from the verse in Haggai, li ha-kesef li ha-zahav ni'um Hashem tzvaot. All of the gold and silver belongs to God, says God. So basically, you didn't do these, the various things that you spent your time on, you didn't do them in order to help out the people of Israel. You just did it entirely for yourselves. Now, for people who are in the summer kollel, if you remember yesterday, we saw a very interesting story in Masechet Shabbat, where one of the rabbis, Rabbi Yehuda, praises the Romans for building markets and bathhouses and bridges. And if you remember, it's Rabbi Shimon who basically says in that Gemara exactly what God says over here. The Romans, when they built these things, they just built them for their own pleasures. They built those bathhouses just to pamper themselves. They built those markets not for commerce, but just in order to have a place for the prostitutes to find their clients. So it's all just for themselves. So it seems like that is a familiar kind of idea, right? That the Romans, it might seem as if they have done these great public works, but really it was all just for themselves. And so therefore God does not accept their idea that they are deserving of reward for Torah, for enabling the people of Israel to keep the Torah. And instead God asks them, Klum yesh vachem magid zot? Can any of you people from Rome, do any of you know the Torah? Shne'emar mi bahem yagid zot, because in that original verse from Isaiah that this whole Gemara started off with, right? God says, can any of you speak this? Ve'ein zot ela Torah, and the word zot refers to the Torah itself, as we know from Deuteronomy chapter 4. V'zot haTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Israel. This is the law that Moses set before the people of Israel. And so zot, the word zot refers to the Torah, and therefore in the verse in Isaiah, when we're told mi bahem yagid zot, can any of you talk about this? That means, are any of you well-versed in the Torah? And of course, no one in Rome is well-versed in the Torah. And we're told miyad yatzru b'pachei nefesh. So the people of Rome depart, and they're all sort of feeling dejected, right? They were hoping that they were going to be able to advance the argument that would get them a reward, but in fact, they are not successful. Yatzu malchut Romi, so the people of Rome leave. V'nichnesa malchut paras achareha, right? The kingdom of Persia comes in afterwards. They too are hoping to be able to collect a reward. God says to them, B'maya saktem, well, what have you occupied yourself with? What have you been doing with your time? And they say, Ribono shel olam, Lord of the world, harbe gisharim gasharnu. We built bridges. Harbe krachim kavashnu. We conquered cities. Harbe milchamot asinu. We waged wars. The kulam lo asinu ela bishvil Yisrael. And all of these things that we did, we really only did it for the sake of Israel, Kadesh yidasku b'Torah, so that they would be able to learn Torah. We took care of all these other things just so that way they could learn Torah, and therefore we deserve to be rewarded for their Torah. Amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kol ma she'asitem letzorach atzmechem asitem. God says, actually, all those things that you did, you just did them for yourselves. Tikantem gisharim litol mehem meches. Why did you build bridges? Not because you wanted to make it easier for people to travel, just because you wanted to collect tolls. It's an interesting idea about bridges, right? The goal of the bridge builder is just to be able to collect a toll. Krachim and all those cities that you subdued, it wasn't for the sake of the people of Israel, but rather la'asot bahem angaria. You wanted to be able to sort of impose forced labor, and so you conquered cities in order to have, to have slaves, basically, who you could force to work for you. Milchamot, and when it comes to wars, ani asiti, God says, I actually run all the wars. Shene'amar Hashem ish milchamas. We know from the Song of the Sea, God is a man of war, and God says, any wars that happen that are productive, God says, I am the one involved in them, which is actually a really interesting idea. Klum yesh vachem magid zot, but is there any one of you who can speak zot, who knows the Torah? Shne'amar mi bahem yagid zot ve'in zot ela Torah, right, as we saw before. The verse in Isaiah says, can any of you say zot? And zot refers to the Torah. And of course, no one in Persia, none of the Persians have learned any Torah, and so none of them can speak the words of Torah. Miyad yatzu milefanav mipachei nefesh. And so the Persians also retreat from God, also feeling dejected because they are not going to receive this reward. And the Gemara now, as a side note, says, "V'chi me'achar dechazit malchut paras to malchut romi de lo ma'anya v'lo midei my tama ayla." Right? When the Persians saw that the Roman argument didn't win, right? The Romans who said, "We built markets, we built bathhouses, we collected gold and silver." If that argument wasn't any good, why did the Persians think that their argument about building bridges and subduing cities and waging war? Why did they think that would be any better? And the Gemara says, well, maybe they thought to themselves, Maybe they thought to themselves, well, the Romans destroyed the temple, but we, the Persians, rebuilt it, or at least, allowed it to be rebuilt. And so therefore, maybe the Persians thought they had a better chance, but it turns out that they didn't. The story now says, in fact, each and every nation comes forward, tries to make an argument about how what they did was really for the sake of Israel, so that Israel could learn Torah, and each and every nation is rejected. And actually, I left out a small part over here in the interest of time, but because I think it was Evelyn, I think because of your point, I'll just tell you that at this point in the story, the other nations say, well, wait a minute, if you had offered us the Torah, we would have received it. And then God says, I did offer you the Torah. And they say, okay, fine, you offered us the Torah, but you didn't hold that mountain over our heads the way you held the mountain over the heads of the people of Israel. And in the end, the nations say to God, Ribono shel olam, Yisrael shekibluha, hechan kaimuha. They said, look, okay, fine. The people of Israel, they accepted the Torah, but they didn't actually keep the Torah, right? And this reminds us, of course, of source number 2 in Shemot Rabba, right? The idea that you can sort of happily accept the Torah, but if you're then not willing to follow up on your acceptance, doesn't really mean anything, right? The 5th sharecropper accepted the field, but if the 5th sharecropper wasn't willing to work the field, how valuable is the acceptance? So the other nations say, look, Israel might have accepted the Torah, but they haven't kept the Torah, and if they haven't kept the Torah, they are no better than we are, and we should all receive the same reward. Amar le'hem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ani me'id bahem shekimu et Torah kula. God responds to them, and God says, look, I can testify myself that the people of Israel have kept the whole Torah. At which point the nations say something that is, pretty chutzpahdik. They say, Ribono shel olam, klum yesh av sheme'id al beno. The nations say, God, you're really not a valid witness over here, right? You can't testify that the people of Israel have kept the Torah, because we know that parents cannot testify about their children. And we know that God thinks of the people of Israel as God's children, as we know from the verse in Exodus chapter 4, B'ni b'chori Yisrael, right? God says, you, Israel, are, sorry, the English is over here. Israel is my firstborn. And so therefore, God, you are not a valid witness. So God says, fine, I won't be the one to testify. Mikem yavo v'ya'idu b'hem b'Yisrael shekimu et haTorah kula. God says, okay, I'll call upon witnesses from amongst you, other nations of the world, and they will testify that Israel has kept the Torah. Yavo Nimrod v'ya'id b'Avraham shelo avad avodat kochavim. Let Nimrod come and testify that Avraham did not worship idols, even though Nimrod threw him into a fiery furnace as a result. Yavo Lavan v'ya'id b'Yaakov shelo nichshad al hagezel. Let Lavan come and testify about Yaakov. Yaakov, in fact, did not steal anything, even though Lavan kept switching his salary around, and he accused Yaakov of stealing his idols, but in fact, Yaakov did not. Tavo eshet Potifera. Let the Potiphar's wife come and testify about Yosef, that he did not commit adultery with her, despite the fact that she tried to seduce him. Let Nebuchadnezzar come and testify that Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah did not bow down to an idol. Let King Darius come and testify about Daniel, that he continued to pray to God, even though Darius tried to force him to pray to Darius. Yavo Bildad HaShuchi v'Tzofar HaNaamati v'Elifaz HaTebani v'Eliyahu ben Barchael HaBuzi v'ya'idu b'hem b'Yisrael shekimu et kol haTorah kula. Let the 4 friends of Job, of Eov, come and testify also that the people of Israel have kept the whole Torah. Shene'emar v'yishma'u v'yobru emet. As the verse, that original verse from Isaiah says, they will listen and they will say, yes, it is true. Okay, so this part over here is kind of interesting, right? God is sort of summoning witnesses from among the other nations to testify that the people of Israel have kept the Torah. To some extent, it's a little bit unfair, right? Because we're kind of choosing the heroes of the people of Israel, right? The fact that these people didn't sin doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of Israel kept the Torah. But one of the points that Professor Jeffrey Rubenstein, in his book where he discusses the story, one of the points that he makes is that these different stories undercut the nation's argument that they did everything in order to help Israel keep the Torah, because these are all examples of various figures who tried to incite the people of Israel into sinning, right? Nimrod tries to make Abraham bow down to idols. Eshet Potiphar, Potiphar's wife, tries to seduce Joseph into committing adultery and so forth. And so the idea is that actually the people of Israel keep the Torah against the wishes and desires of the other nations who keep on trying to prevent them from keeping the Torah. Okay, so this is not a winning argument, right? Then other nations try to say the people of Israel didn't keep the Torah, and God says, no, they really did. So now the nations need a new thing to say because they still really want to get their reward. And this is what they say. They say, Ribono Shalom, tina lanu merosh v'na'asena. They say, give us another chance. Okay, it's true. You offered it to us before at Sinai. We all said no, but let's try again, right? Give it to us now, merosh, and we will definitely keep it. Now we will say yes. Amar lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, shotim sheba olam, you foolish people. Misha tarach be'erev Shabbat yochal b'Shabbat. A person who works hard to prepare for Shabbat, that person has food to eat and enjoy on Shabbat. Misha lo tarach be'erev Shabbat mehichan yochal b'Shabbat. But a person who lolls about all day and does not work to prepare food for Shabbat, what will that person eat on Shabbat? Which is kind of an interesting image, but I think the idea seems to be now that we're at the point of getting rewarded, now is not really the time where it means anything to accept the Torah, right? You have to accept the Torah without fully knowing what the reward is in the moment. And if you're only accepting it right now because I'm giving out rewards, that kind of doesn't really count. But God says, Ella afal pichein, even though it is really too late for you, still mitzvah kala yeshli. I do have one small mitzvah that I'll give you as a practice mitzvah to see how you do with it. The sukkah shema, right? The mitzvah I'm giving you is to build a sukkah. L'chu v'asuota, go and do it, right? Go and build your sukkot, and let's see how you do with your one mitzvah. The Gemara then says, "Umi matzit amar tachi." It doesn't really make sense that God is telling them this. V'ha'amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, mai dichtiv asher anochi mitzavcha hayom la'asotam v'lo lemachar la'asotam, hayom la'asotam v'lo hayom litol sachar. Don't we know from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi that mitzvot are only valid and valuable if you are not rewarded immediately upon doing them, right? The idea behind doing a mitzvah, the idea behind performing one of God's commandments is that you don't immediately get rewarded for it. If you were immediately going to get rewarded for it, it wouldn't have the same moral weight, right? When the people of Israel accept the Torah at Sinai, the reason why that matters is because they are not going to be immediately rewarded for it. They're going to have to perform all these mitzvot with a sense that they are doing God's will, and that at some point in the future, God will reward them for it. So why is God offering the other nations a mitzvah right now? And the response is, why does he do this? Why does God do this? God doesn't want to be too harsh to God's creatures, right? And so if all the other nations are saying, please just give us another chance, God isn't going to reject their plea outright. So God gives them a chance, and the chance is the mitzvah of Sukkah. And now the Gemara has another question. The Gemara says, "V'amai karile mitzvah kala." Why specifically is Sukkah called a very easy, simple mitzvah? Right? It's actually not so simple. We have an entire masechet that talks about exactly how the Sukkah needs to be built and what it needs to be made of and so forth. And they say the reason why it's considered to be relatively easy is mishum deleit bechisron kis, because it's not very expensive. You can construct a Sukkah. I mean, I guess it depends what kind of Sukkah you buy, but in theory, you could construct a Sukkah out of very inexpensive materials. And so therefore, it's considered to be a mitzvah kala because it doesn't cost a lot to do it. And so God says, can you do this mitzvah? It doesn't cost a lot. Let's see how you will do it. So the other nations are really excited. They want the Torah. What do? Miyad kol echad v'echad notel v'holech v'oseh sukkah b'rosh gago. Immediately, each and every one of the people goes and builds a sukkah on his roof. One of the other points that Professor Rubinstein makes about this story that I like a lot is that if you remember, the kinds of things that the Romans and the Persians are really proud of building are bathhouses and bridges and markets, right? Like sort of serious large structures. And what God now asks them to do in terms of keeping the Torah is not to build something heavy and weighty and impressive that will last, but rather to build something very transient, right? To build a sukkah doesn't need to last forever. It can be made of very humble materials, but that's really, if you build that for God, that is more valuable than these, stone structures that are built for themselves. And so the nations are very eager, right? Each one of them goes and builds a sukkah on his or her roof. V'akadosh baruch hu magdir alehem chama b'tkufat Tammuz. And what does God do? God brings a summer heat, right? A very hot sun, right? It's the season of Tammuz right now. For those of us who are out in the sun today or on Monday, we might remember how hot it was, right? So God blazes upon them this burning hot sun of Tammuz. And each and every one of these nations of the world who built their own sukkah, what do? They kick their sukkah and they leave because it's so uncomfortable. And we quote a source from Psalms that supports the idea that they do this. Now, the Gemara is kind of interested in the fact that God causes the sun to blaze upon the other nations in their sukkot. We're told, Makdir v'ha'amart ena kadosh baruch hu ba b'tironia im briotav. So they say, well, wait a second, why does God cause it to be so hot? I thought the point was that God doesn't deal in this very peremptory way with the other nations, and so if God doesn't deal imperiously with God's creations, then why is God sort of taunting them by making it so hot? That doesn't seem particularly nice or fair. And the response is, Mishum Yisrael nami zimni demashcha lehu tkufat Tammuz ad chaga v'have lehu tzara. We say, well, actually, the reason why God causes it to be so hot is that sometimes, even for the people of Israel, the really hot season of Tammuz continues on all the way until the festival of Sukkot. And sometimes it's really hot for the people of Israel and their Sukkot too. So God wants the other nations to experience the Sukkah with the full range of experiences that Israel also has. And so therefore God causes it to be really hot. And the Gemara says, well, but wait a second, if it's really hot, mitzta'er patur mina sukkah. Didn't Rabba teach that if you're really uncomfortable in your sukkah, you can leave? And so actually when the other nations leave their sukkot, they're really doing the same thing that the people of Israel do. Because if the people of Israel are really uncomfortable in their sukkot, they're also allowed to leave. And the response is, nahi de patur bi'ute mi miva'at. Right? It's true that the people of Israel are exempt from their Sukkot if they're uncomfortable, but when they leave their Sukkot because they're uncomfortable, they don't kick their Sukkot. They leave with a sense of sadness, right? What they really want to do is keep the Mitzvah of Sukkah, and if they can't because it's uncomfortable, then they're sad about it. They don't kick the Sukkot in anger. And I think the point maybe that the story is trying to make is that, well, okay, let's see the very end of it, and then we can talk about the point. We're told in the end, Miyad Hakadosh Baruch Hu Yoshev U'Misachek Alehem, right? And God, when God sees us, God just laughs because God kind of knew that this is the way it was going to go the whole time. Shneimar, as we know from the verse in Tehillim, Yoshev B'Shamay Nischak Hashem Yil'ag Lamo. Right? God kind of laughs at the whole, the way that this whole thing plays out. But I think if we were to sort of think about the main question of this last source, which is, what if the other nations want a second chance, right? We understand, even if we accept the Aggadic proposition that God has offered the Torah around to everybody beforehand, maybe the fact that they said no at the beginning doesn't mean that they're always going to say no. And maybe doesn't God, if the other nations are willing to accept the Torah later on in the story, then wouldn't God want them to accept that Torah, right? Wouldn't God want this kind of universal acceptance of the Torah to be the case? And I think what happens in the story is that we get the sense that God is willing to give the other nations a chance, but God isn't going to make it easy for them. Right? God makes it difficult for them. And the reason why God makes it difficult for them is that God wants to see how they will react to the difficulty. Because it doesn't really matter if they stay in the sukkah or not. Because even the people of Israel are allowed to leave their sukkah if it's too hot. What really matters is how they feel about it, right? If the other nations kick their sukkot on their way out, it means they don't love God's Torah. They don't love the mitzvot. They're not happy to perform them and sad when they can't. Instead, they're just kind of, angry at the whole endeavor. Whereas the people of Israel, the sense is they have the right kind of feeling about the Torah. And so regardless of whether it's true that really all of Israel kept the Torah or all of Israel, maybe some of them didn't, either way, on the whole, the people of Israel love the Torah and care about God's commandments. And that seems to be, at least for this source, that is why they wind up being chosen. So I think this source kind of plays with the idea that the other nations are offered the Torah, rejected, but then they might want another shot at it. But I think the sense ultimately is that the reason why the other nations don't get to have the Torah, based on, at least on this story, is not because God kind of, creates a situation where they won't want to say yes to it. It's because ultimately they don't have the same feeling as the people of Israel. And it could be that the feeling of the people of Israel that kind of impels them to say, yes, whatever God says we'll do, which might be kind of a little bit too, overly blithe or not serious enough in source number 2. I think the sense is that that feeling, though, is actually the sort of redemptive thing for the people of Israel, because they love these commandments, and they're sad when they don't get to keep them. So I think if we were to kind of think about these sources overall, right, I think we get the sense that the rabbis are very interested in this question of why do the people of Israel in particular get the Torah, right? Why is it only for them? Isn't there something that is kind of unfair about that? And so as a way of sort of thinking that through, right, I think they create this Aggadic idea that the other nations also have a chance. God offers it to them. And depending on which source you're looking at, God either offers it to the other nations in a neutral way, where they could have said yes or they could have said no, or God offers it to the other nations. And if they really wanted it, they could have said yes, but God doesn't make it easy for them, right? God specifically tells them the mitzvot that will be difficult for them. And I think there's a sense that the people of Israel want this particular relationship with God. The people of Israel feel a little threatened by these other nations, right? And it's certainly in source number 3 in Rabba, they kind of feel like the last ones invited to the party. They don't feel great about that. But ultimately, it's the way the people of Israel sort of feel about the Torah. That's what really matters. And in the beginning, the excitement that causes them to say Na'aseh v'nishma seems to be the reason why they alone are able to receive the Torah. And in the end, in our last source, the way that they feel about performing the mitzvot is really what matters. Either way, right, when it's really hot, both the other nations of the world and also the people of Israel leave their Sukkot, but the people of Israel don't keep their Sukkot. They are sad to leave their Sukkot, and that means that they have kind of a love for God's Torah, and that I think we would extend it out to say that anyone else who would have that feeling, right, would have that feeling of love for God's Torah and that kind of willingness to accept the Torah as a whole, right, they would also be welcome. God would want everyone else who is willing to kind of feel the way the people of Israel do about it. But there's a sense that most people don't, and that is why, the Torah becomes the purview specifically of Israel. Okay, it is 9:01, so I will stop talking. I'm so happy to stay if people have questions. I see Judith has a question, but obviously if anyone needs to leave, they should feel free to do so. Judith, please, what is your question?
You said before that the story is told from different perspectives, and it changes. The same scene is seen differently from different perspectives. This last explanation is obviously being seen from the perspective of the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. This is how they see themselves and their attachment to God. I have this feeling that it left the door open because Christianity took exactly that position and said, you know what, we're better at keeping, and we're the new Israel. Because the relationship has shifted from you to us precisely for that. In other words, I feel like they're using the same kind of reasoning, but it's from the perspective of one of the nations, not Israel.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about that is that I think ultimately it feels as if like the way the people of Israel feel about the commandments is what matters, but it still is the commandments, right? It's not how they feel about God. It's how they feel specifically about, right? Throughout the discussion of here, what it means to accept the Torah is to keep the commandments. It's not to have any particular belief, right? When the other nations say what's written in the Torah, God doesn't say, believe in God, that's it, right? It's not about belief. It's always about an action, right? Don't steal, do build a sukkah, whatever it is, right? The people of Israel keep the laws and they're willing to keep the laws and they love the laws. And that is what makes the Torah theirs. And I think that might be sort of the kind of counter-Christian polemic here, right? Right? Christians think it's about kind of sort of the way you feel about God, not specifically keeping the commandments of the Torah. And I think all of these stories put the commandments kind of front and center in terms of like what it is that what it would mean, what it means to keep the Torah is specifically to keep the laws. But thank you so much for the comment. Okay, any other questions or thoughts? Sarah, I don't know if you saw, were there any other questions in the chat that I might have missed?
There's a lot of conversation back and forth. I don't think there were any specific questions necessarily to bring up at this point, but there was a lot of really great conversation.
Okay, great. Well, I'm excited to read it afterwards. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great pleasure to work with everybody. For the people on screen, it was really nice to watch your faces as we were learning together. So thanks for keeping your cameras on. Okay, great. Sarah, should we just log out? Is that the...
I have a bit of a wrap up and a plug for everyone. So thank you so much for teaching such a fascinating class. And then also for everyone attending, thank you for joining us on Zoom, Drisha Live, and Facebook. Our next bit of summer programming will continue on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. with the next class in Rabbi David Silber's series, Isaac and Rebecca, Partners in Succession. And the next session in this series on universalism and particularism will be a week from tonight, next Wednesday at 8 p.m. with Dr. Malka Z. Simkovich, teaching on the early development of Jewish universalism from the Bible to the Rabbinic period. And you can find out more information about all of those classes, as well as all of our summer programming on our website at www.drisha.org/classes. So again, thank you everyone for being here, and we hope to see you again soon at Drisha.